Journeys to Bokhara by Alexander Burns. Historical background of Alexander Burns's travels to Bokhara, summary of the first, second and third chapters, and audio rendition of chapter 3 of his book titled Peshawar. Sir Alexander Burns, 1805 to 1841, was a Scottish explorer, diplomat and political officer in the service of the British East India Company. His remarkable journey to Bokhara, modern-day Bokhara in Uzbekistan, took place between 1831 and 1833 at the height of what would later become known as the Great Game, the intense strategic rivalry between the British and Russian empires for supremacy in Central Asia. Born in Montrose, Scotland, Burns joined the Bombay Army at the age of 16 and rapidly acquired proficiency in both Hindustani and Persian, skills that would prove invaluable for his future intelligence and diplomatic work. It was Burns himself who proposed the covert expedition to Bokhara, recognising the urgent need for Britain to survey the region and observe the expansionist activities of the Russians in Central Asia. The expedition. In 1832, Burns set off from India with a small party comprising an army doctor and 2 Indian assistants who served as surveyor and secretary. The group travelled in local dress and adopted whatever personas each situation required, disguising themselves variously as Armenian horse traders, Persian secretaries, Hindu mystics, or Bokharan Jews to avoid detection and ensure their safety. The journey's official cover was a mission to deliver a letter and gifts, including 5 large English dray horses from King George IV, to Maharaja Ranjit Singh of Lahore. However, the true purpose was espionage, mapping the 1,000-mile route up the Indus River through the hostile territories of the emirs of Scinde and gathering intelligence on Russian movements. After reaching Lahore, Burns and his party continued through Afghanistan into barely explored Central Asian territory. Having reached Bokhara, they pressed on overland to the Caspian Sea and then to Tehran, finally returning to Bombay by sea in 1833. Publication and impact. The account of his adventures was published in 3 volumes in 1834 under the title Travels into Bokhara, being the account of a journey from India to Kabul, Tartary and Persia. Also, narrative of a voyage on the Indus from the sea to Lahore, with presents from the King of Great Britain. The work became an instant bestseller, captivating the British public with its tales of adventure and its detailed observations of geography, peoples, and political dynamics in regions largely unknown to European readers. Chapter 3. Peshawar. The 3rd chapter of Volume 1, titled Peshawar, describes Burns's observations during his time in this strategically vital city. By the period of Burns's travels, Peshawar had fallen under Sikh rule following its conquest by Maharaja Ranjit Singh's forces. The Sikhs exacted a tribute from Peshawar, which at that time amounted to 60 horses and some rice, a crop for which the region was particularly known. The tribute was enforced annually by a Sikh army that crossed the Indus River and laid waste to the territories if payment was not made promptly. Burns notes the complex political relationships among the regional powers. The chiefs of Peshawar and Kabul, who were brothers, were at enmity with each other. Meanwhile, the Khan of Kandahar was allied with Peshawar against any potential attack. Burns also observed the looming threat from Dost Muhammad Khan of Kabul, predicting that the territories of both Peshawar and Kandahar might eventually be threatened or taken by him. Later career and death. Following the success of his travels, Burns continued his diplomatic activities in Afghanistan. He was a key player in the events leading up to the First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 1842. However, despite his expertise and local knowledge, he was widely known by the affectionate nickname Secunda. Burns was unable to prevent the disastrous British invasion of Afghanistan, which he personally believed to be a colossal blunder. His tragic end came in November 1841. During a popular uprising against the British presence in Kabul, Burns was murdered by a mob. His death made him a convenient scapegoat for the failed war, and his great popularity plummeted in the aftermath. It is only in recent years that historians have begun to re-evaluate his career and recognise his significant contributions to the great game. Legacy. Alexander Burns's Travels into Bokhara remains an invaluable primary source for understanding early 19th century Central Asia. The work provides detailed descriptions of the geography, political dynamics, cultural practices, and key personalities of the region during a period of intense imperial competition. His observations, including his accounts of the Sikh court, Afghan tribal politics, and the brutal governorship of figures like the Neapolitan mercenary Avitabile in Peshawar, offer modern readers a vivid window into a vanished world at the crossroads of empires. Volume 1, Chapter 3, Peshawar, Entrance into the Country of the Afghans. It required some arrangement to commence our advance into the country of the Afghans, for they and the Sikhs entertain the most deep-rooted animosity towards each other. At Attock, a friendly letter was sent to us by the chief of Peshawar, expressive of his good wishes. I, therefore, addressed that personage, Sultan Muhammad Khan, informing him of our intentions and soliciting his protection. I likewise sent a letter of introduction from Runjeet to the chief of Akora. But so inconstant is power in these countries that person had been ejected during the few weeks we had been travelling from Lahore. But the usurper opened the communication and kindly dispatched a party to meet us. The subjects of Ranjit Singh escorted us to their frontier, which is 3 miles beyond the Indus. Here we met the Afghans. Neither party would approach, and we drew up at a distance of about 300 yards from each other. The Sikhs gave us their Wagru-ye Futih, synonymous with our 3 cheers, and we advanced and delivered ourselves to the Mohammedans, who said, Wassalam alaikum, peace be unto you. We trod our way to Akora with our new people, the Kutuks, a lawless race, and alighted at that village, which is nearly deserted from the constant inroads of the Sikhs. The chief immediately waited upon us and expressed his dissatisfaction at our having purchased some articles from the bazaar, since it was a reflection on his hospitality. I begged his pardon and placed the mistake on my ignorance of the Afghan customs, adding that I would not forget, as I advanced, the hospitality of the Kutuks of Akora. The chief took his leave, charging us, before his departure, to consider ourselves as secure as eggs under a hen, a homely enough simile, the truth of which we had no reason to doubt. Yet it was at this place that poor Moorcroft and his party encountered some serious difficulties, and were obliged to fight their way. We here received a second letter from the chief of Peshawar, which was most satisfactory, since it contained a friendly reply without his having received any of the letters of introduction which we possessed. It intimated that a person was approaching to conduct us. Precautionary arrangements. We had now quitted the territories of Hindustan and entered on a land where covetousness of a neighbour's goods is the ruling passion. We therefore marched with our baggage. Our few servants were also divided into regular watches for the night. We had 2 Afghans, 2 Indians, and 2 natives of Kashmir. A Kashmirian paired with an Indian, and the trustworthy with the most lazy, while we ourselves were to superintend the posting of the sentries. Our people laughed heartily at this military disposition, but it was ever after enforced in all our travels. We ourselves were now living as natives, and had ceased to repine at the hardness of the ground and the miserable hovels in which we sometimes halted. I had also disposed of my own valuables in what then appeared to me a masterly manner. A letter of credit for 5,000 rupees was fastened to my left arm, in the way that the Asiatics wear amulets. My polyglot passport was fixed to my right arm, and a bag of ducats was tied round my waist. I also distributed a part of my ready money to each of the servants, and so perfect was the check that had been established over them, that we never lost a single ducat in all our journey, and found most faithful servants in men who might have ruined and betrayed us. We trusted them, and they rewarded our confidence. One man, Ghulam Hussain, a native of Surat, followed me throughout the whole journey, cooked our food, and never uttered a complaint at the performance of such duties, foreign as they were to his engagements. He is now with me in England. Our conductor on the part of Ranjit Singh left us at Akora. Chune Lal, but that was his name, was a quiet, inoffensive Brahmin who did not seem at ease across the Indus. I gave him a farewell letter to his master, and, since His Highness had written for my sentiments regarding the salt mines of the Punjab and the best means of profiting by them, I gave him a long account of salt monopolies, telling him that it was better to levy high duties upon salt than grain. I told him also, in as many words, that the salt range was as valuable a portion of his territory as the Valley of Kashmir. But I do not believe that His Highness stood in need of much explanation, as the measures which we had seen at the mines practically proved. Fields of battle. On our road to Akora, we passed a field of battle at the small village of Sidhu, where 8,000 Sikhs had defended themselves against an enraged population of 150,000 Mohammedans. Bood Singh, their commander, threw up a small breastwork of loose stones and extricated himself from his dilemma so as to secure the praise even of his enemies. We now saw the place and the bleaching bones of the horses, which had fallen on the occasion. On the next march, we passed the more celebrated field of Nusharo, to which our attention had been directed by Ranjit Singh himself. He here encountered the Afghans for the last time, but their chief, Azim Khan, was separated from the greater part of his army by the river of Kabul. The Sikhs defeated the divisions on the opposite side, mainly through the personal courage of Ranjit Singh, who carried a hillock with his guards, from which his other troops had 3 times retreated. Azim Khan, of Kabul, fled without encountering the successful army, which had partly crossed the river to oppose him. It is believed that he feared the capture of his treasure, which would have fallen into Ranjit's power if he had advanced. But it is also said that he was terrified by the shouts of the Sikhs on the night of their victory. He attributed their exclamations to the fresh arrival of troops, for they have a custom of shouting on such occasions. We have already compared this potentate with Porus, and the similar stratagem by which Alexander defeated that prince will also be remembered. As the Greeks had terrified his predecessor on the Hydaspes, the Sikhs now frighten the Afghans by their shouts and paeans, entrance into Peshawar. As we traversed the plain to Peshawar, I felt elevated and happy. Thyme and violets perfumed the air, and the green sod and clover put us in mind of a distant country. The violet has the name of Gul e Puegambur, or the rose of the prophet, par excellence, I suppose, from its fragrance. At Pirpi, which is a march from Peshawar, we were joined by 6 horsemen, whom the chief sent to escort us. We saddled at sunrise, though it rained heavily, and accompanied the party to the city, sorely trying the patience of the horsemen by declining to halt halfway, that they might give timely information of our approach. We pushed on till near the city, when their persuasion could be no longer resisted. The chief sent us only to welcome you, and has ordered his son to meet you outside the city, said their commander, and we are now within a few hundred yards of his house. We halted, and in a few minutes the son of the chief made his appearance, attended by an elephant and a body of horse. He was his eldest son, a handsome boy, about 12 years old, and dressed in a blue tunic with a cashmere shawl as a turban. We dismounted on the high road and embraced, when the youth immediately conducted us to the presence of his father. Never were people received with more kindness. He met us in person at the doorway and led us inside of an apartment studded with mirror glass and daubed over with paint in exceedingly bad taste. His house, his country, his property, his all were ours, He was the ally of the British government, and he had shown it by his kindness to Mr. Moorcroft, which he considered as a treaty of friendship. We were not the persons who wished to infringe its articles. Sultan Muhammad Khan is about 35 years old, of rather tall stature and dark complexion. He was dressed in a pelisse, lined with fur, and ornamented over the shoulders with the down of the peacock, which had a richer look than the furniture that surrounded him. We were glad to withdraw and change our wet clothes, and were conducted to the seraglio of Sultan Muhammad Khan, which he had prepared, I need not add, emptied for our reception. This was, indeed, a kind of welcome we had not anticipated. Afghan entertainment. An hour had not passed before we were visited by Pir Muhammad Khan, the younger brother of the chief, a jolly and agreeable person. The chief himself followed in the course of the evening, and a sumptuous dinner succeeded, of which we all partook. The meat was delicious, and so was the cookery. I need not add that we ate with our hands, but we soon ceased to wonder at a nobleman tearing a lamb in pieces and selecting the choice bits which he held out for our acceptance. A long roll of leavened bread was spread in front of each of us as a plate, and, since its size diminished as the meat disappeared, it did its part well. Pilaus and stews, sweets and sours filled the trays, but the bonne bouche of the day was a lamb that had never tasted aught but milk. A bitter orange had been squeezed over it and made it very savoury. 4 trays of sweetmeats followed with fruit, and the repast concluded with sherbet, mixed with snow, the sight of which delighted us as much as our new friends. A watch of night was spent before we broke up, and after the chief had repeated in a whisper his devotion to our nation and anxiety for our welfare, he bade us good night. I had almost lost the use of my legs from the irksome position of constraint in which I had so long sat. If we had been prepared to like the manners of this people, there was much to confirm it on this evening. Visitors. Ride out with the chief. On the following day we were introduced to the remainder of the family. There are 2 brothers besides the chief, and a host of sons and relations. The most remarkable person of the family was a son of Futti Khan, the vizier of Shah Mahmud, who had been so basely and cruelly murdered. The lad is about 14 years of age, and the solitary descendant of his ill-fated father. The sons of the Mirwais and Mukhtar Odula, whose parents had dethroned Shah Shuja, were among the party, and the day passed most agreeably. The people were sociable and well informed, free from prejudice on points of religion, and many of them were well versed in Asiatic history. They were always cheerful and frequently noisy in their good humour. During the conversation, many of them rose up and prayed in the room when the stated hours arrived. As we got better acquainted in Peshawar, our circle of acquaintance was widely extended, and visitors would drop in at all hours, and more particularly if they found us alone. The Afghans never sit by themselves, and always made some apology if they found any of us solitary, though it would have been sometimes agreeable to continue so. In the afternoon, the chief invited us to accompany him and his brothers to see the environs of Peshawar. The doctor stayed away, but I rode with them. Of the town of Peshawar I shall say nothing, since the graphic and accurate descriptions of Mr. Elphinstone require no addition. Such, indeed, is the nature of the information contained in his valuable work, that I shall always avoid the ground on which he trod, and, in Afghanistan, confine myself to incidents and adventures of a personal nature. I say this in my own defence. I had accompanied the chief on a day most favourable to a stranger, the Nowroz, or New Year, the 21st of March, which is celebrated by the people. The greater part of the community were gathered in gardens, and paraded about with nosegays and bunches of peach blossom. We entered the garden of Ali Murdan Khan, and seated ourselves on the top of the garden house, and looked down upon the assembled multitude. The trees were covered with blossom, and nothing could be more beautiful than the surrounding scene. The chief and his brothers took great pains to point out the neighbouring hills to me, explaining by whom they were inhabited, with every other particular which they thought might interest. They also informed me that the nobleman who had prepared this garden possessed the philosopher's stone, the Sungi Fars, since there was no other way of accounting for his great riches. They added that he threw it into the Indus, which at least eases them of the dilemma as to his heir. Chief, his character. We soon got accustomed to our new mode of life, and, as we made it a rule never on any occasion to write during the day or in public, had leisure to receive every person who came to see us. In a short time, we became acquainted with the whole society of Peshawar, and, during the 30 days we remained there, had an uninterrupted series of visiting and feasting. Nothing, however, more contributed to our comfort and happiness than the kindness of our worthy host. Sultan Muhammad Khan was not the illiterate Afghan whom I expected to find, but an educated, well-bred gentleman whose open and affable manner made a lasting impression upon me. As we were sitting down to dinner, he would frequently slip in, quite unattended, and pass the evening with us. He would sometimes be followed by various trays of dishes, which he had had cooked in his harem, and believed might be palatable to us. He is a person more remarkable for his urbanity than his wisdom. But he transacts all his own business. He is a brave soldier. His seraglio has about 30 inmates, and he has already had a family of 60 children. He could not tell the exact number of survivors when I asked him. An Afghan manner of spending a Friday. On the Friday after our arrival, we accompanied the chief and his family to some flower gardens, where we spent the greater part of the day in conversation. The chief himself sat under one tree, and we ranged ourselves beneath another. Iced sherbet and confections were brought to us, and we heard much of the munificence of Mr. Elphinstone from Mullah Najib, an elderly man who had accompanied him to Calcutta. In the afternoon, we returned to the King's Garden, which is a most spacious one, and sat down on the ground with Sultan Muhammad Khan and his family to partake of sugar cane cut into small pieces. 4 of the chief's sons accompanied us, and it was delightful to see the affectionate notice which he took of his children, none of whom were 5 years old. Each of them sat on horseback in front of one of his suite, and held the reins in a masterly manner, for the Doranese are taught to ride from infancy. We then followed the chief to his family burying ground, where his 2 elder brothers, Atta and Yar Muhammad Khan, who fell in battle, lie interred. The whole branches of the family were present, and offered up their afternoon prayers in a mosque, close to the grave. The sight was an impressive one, and the more so, since the sons of the deceased brothers were among the party. The day finished with a visit to a holy man named Sheikh Iwaz, and such is the usual manner of spending a Friday among the Dorani nobles of Peshawar. The chief's retinue consisted of his relations and servants. He had no guards, and, at first starting, was only accompanied by ourselves and 2 horsemen. There is a simplicity and freedom about these people greatly to be admired, and, whatever the rule may be, I can vouch for petitioners having an ear, at least, given to their complaints. Everyone seems on an equality with the chief, and the meanest servant addresses him without ceremony. He himself seems quite free from every sort of pride or affectation, and is only to be distinguished in the crowd by his dress, in which he is fond of richness and ornament. Horrible spectacle. In one of our rides about Peshawar with the chief, we had a specimen of justice and Mohammedan retribution. As we passed the suburbs of the city, we discovered a crowd of people, and, on a nearer approach, saw the mangled bodies of a man and woman, the former not quite dead, lying on a dunghill. The crowd instantly surrounded the chief and our party, and one person stepped forward and represented, in a trembling attitude, to Sultan Muhammad Khan, that he had discovered his wife in an act of infidelity, and had put both parties to death. He held the bloody sword in his hands, and described how he had committed the deed. His wife was pregnant, and already the mother of 3 children. The chief asked a few questions, which did not occupy him 3 minutes. He then said in a loud voice, "You have acted the part of a good Mohammedan, and performed a justifiable act." He then moved on, and the crowd cried out, "Bravo! Afreen!" The man was immediately set at liberty. We stood by the chief during the investigation, and, when it finished, he turned to me and carefully explained the law. "Guilt," added he, "committed on a Friday is sure to be discovered, for that happened to be the day on which it occurred. There is nothing new in these facts. But, as an European, I felt my blood run chill as I looked on the mangled bodies, and heard the husband justifying the murder of her who had borne him 3 children. Nor was the summary justice of the chief, who happened to be passing, the least remarkable part of the dismal scene. It seems that the exposure of the bodies on a dunghill is believed to expiate in some degree the sins of the culprit, by the example it holds out to the community. They are afterwards interred in the same spot. Brother of the chief. We were invited, shortly after our arrival at Peshawar, to pass a day with the chief's brother, Pir Muhammad Khan. He received us in a garden, under a bower of fruit trees loaded with blossom. Carpets were spread, and the boughs shaken before we sat down, which covered them with the variegated leaves of the apricot and peach. The fragrance and beauty were equally delightful. The party consisted of about 50 persons, all of whom partook of the entertainment, which was on a substantial and large scale. There were performers in attendance, who chanted odes in Pushtu and Persian. The conversation was general and related chiefly to their own expeditions. The children of the chief and his brothers were again present. They rioted among the confectionery, and 4 of them had a pitched battle with the blossom of the trees, which they threw at each other like snow. I do not remember to have seen any place more delightful than Peshawar at this season. The climate, garden, and landscape delight the senses, and to all we had been so fortunate as to add the hospitality of the people. I had brought no presents to conciliate these men, and I therefore would receive none at their hands. But, on the present occasion, our host produced a small horse, of a hill breed, and insisted on my accepting it. "Mr. Moorcroft," said he, "accepted one of these same horses, which availed him in his difficulties, and I cannot, therefore, receive a refusal, since you are entering such dangerous countries." The horse was forcibly sent to my house. The sequel will show the strange providence which is sometimes to be traced in the acts of man. Arrangements for our advance. But our residence at the house of the chief was not without inconvenience, and it required some consideration to devise a plan for our extrication with credit. The chief was at enmity with his brother of Kabul, and wished to persuade us to pass through that city by stealth and without seeing him. He offered, indeed, to send a Persian gentleman as our conductor beyond Afghanistan, and, had I believed the arrangement practicable, I would have rejoiced. But it was obviously difficult to pass through the city of Kabul and the country of its chief without his knowledge, and a discovery of such an attempt might bring down upon us the wrath of a man from whom we had nothing to fear by openly avowing ourselves as British officers. I was resolved, therefore, to trust the chief of Kabul as I had trusted his brother of Peshawar, so soon as I could persuade Sultan Muhammad Khan that our intercourse there should never diminish the regard which we felt for him personally. A few days afterwards, he consented to our writing to Kabul, and notifying our approach to Nuab Jabbar Khan, the brother of the governor whom I addressed under a new seal, cut after the manner of the country, and bearing the name of Sikandar Burns. Sultan Muhammad Khan now confined himself to advice, and such good offices as would conduct us in safety beyond his dominions. He requested that we might still further change our dress, which we did, and left it as the best sign of our poverty. The outer garment which I wore cost me 1.50 rupees, ready-made in the bazaar. We also resolved to conceal our character as Europeans from the common people, though we should frankly avow to every chief, and indeed every individual with whom we might come into contact, our true character. But our compliance with this counsel subjected us to the strongest importunities to avoid Turkestan and pass by the route of Kandahar into Persia. Nothing could save us from the ferocious and man-selling Uzbeks. The country, the people, everything was bad. They judged of the calamities of Moorcroft and his associates, and I listened in silence. The chief thought that he had so far worked upon us to abandon the design, that he prepared various letters for Kandahar and a particular introduction to his brother, who is chief of that place. The chief and his court. Shortly after our arrival in Peshawar, Sultan Muhammad Khan illuminated his palace and invited us to an entertainment given, as he assured us, on our account. His mansion was only separated from ours by a single wall, and he came in person to conduct us in the afternoon. The ladies had been spending the day in these apartments, but the crook was given before we entered, and a solitary eunuch, who looked more like an old woman, only now remained. In the evening the party assembled, which did not exceed 15 persons, the most distinguished in Peshawar. We sat in the hall, which was brilliantly lighted. Behind it there was a large fountain in the interior of the house, shaded by a cupola about 50 feet high, and on the sides of it were different rooms that overlooked the water. The reflection from the dome, which was painted, had a pleasing effect. About 8 o'clock we sat down to dinner, which commenced with sweetmeats and confections that had been prepared in the harem. They were far superior to anything seen in India. The dinner succeeded, and the time passed very agreeably. The chief and his courtiers talked of their wars and revolutions, and I answered their numerous queries regarding our own country. The assembly were ever ready to draw comparisons between anything stated and the records of Asiatic history, referring familiarly to Timur, Babur, and Aurangzeb, and exhibiting at the same time much general knowledge. I gave them accounts of steam engines, galvanic batteries, balloons, and electrifying machines, which appeared to give universal satisfaction. If they disbelieved, they did not express their scepticism. Many of the courtiers, of course, flattered the chief as they commented on his remarks, but their style of address was by no means cringing, and the mild affability of Sultan Muhammad Khan himself quite delighted me. He spoke without reserve of Ranjit Singh, and sighed for some change that might release him from the disgrace of having his son a hostage at Lahore. The subject of the Russians was introduced, and a Persian in the party declared that his country was quite independent of Russia. The chief, with much good humour, remarked that their independence was something like his own with the Sikhs, unable to resist and glad to compromise. Among our visitors, none came more frequently than the sons of the chief and his brothers, and none were more welcome, for they displayed an intelligence and address which surprised me. Nearly the whole of them were suffering from intermittent fever that was soon cured by a few doses of quinine, of which we had a large supply. The knowledge exhibited by these little fellows induced me on one occasion to note their conversation. There were 4 of them present, and none had attained his 12th year. I interrogated them, as they sat round me, on the good qualities of Kabul, giving to each 2 answers. They were as follows: 1. The salubrity of the climate. 2. The flavour of the fruit. 3. The beauty of the people. 4. The handsome bazaar. 5. The citadel of the Bala Hisar. 6. The justice of the ruler. 7. The pomegranates without seed. And 8. Its incomparable ruwash or rhubarb. 4 answers to its bad qualities gave the following information. 1. Food is expensive. 2. The houses cannot be kept in repair without constantly removing the snow from the roof. 3. The floods of the river dirty the streets. And 4. The immorality of the fair sex, which last is a proverb given in a couplet. It does not appear to me that boys in Europe show such precocity, and it is no doubt here attributable to their earlier introduction into the society of grown-up people. When a boy has arrived at his 12th year, a separate establishment is maintained on his account, and, long before that time of life, he is prohibited from frequenting his mother's apartments but on certain occasions. Khoju Muhammad, the eldest son of the chief of Peshawar, whom I have already mentioned, came one day to invite me to dinner, and I expressed some surprise to hear that he had a house of his own. "What?" replied the youth. "Would you have me imbibe the disposition of a woman when I am the son of a Dorani?" I occasionally accompanied these scions to the gardens of Peshawar and found them good associates, as no person ever thought of disturbing us. I remember hearing from one of them a tale of his father's wars and untimely end in battle 2 years before, and how he took the bloody head of his parent in his arms when brought from the field without its trunk. Rambles in Peshawar. These rambles in Peshawar were not always undertaken in such company, for I used latterly to go unattended even by a kapchi or doorkeeper of the chief, who used to accompany us on our first arrival. I visited the Bala Hisar, in which Shah Shuja had received so gorgeously the Kabul mission of 1809. It is now a heap of ruins, having been burned by the Sikhs in one of their expeditions to this country. I also went to the large caravanserai, where that amusing and talented traveller, Mr. Forster, describes with such humour the covetous mullah who wished to steal his clothes. Circumstances were strangely changed since his days, now some 50 years ago. He considered his journey and dangers at an end on reaching Kabul, where we looked for their commencement. Passing a gate of the city, I observed it studded with horseshoes, which are as superstitious emblems in this country as in remote Scotland. A farrier had no customers. A saint to whom he applied recommended his nailing a pair of horseshoes to a gate of the city. He afterwards prospered, and the farriers of Peshawar have since propitiated the same saint by the same expedient, in which they place implicit reliance. One of our most welcome visitors in Peshawar was a seal engraver, a native of the city, who had travelled over the greater part of Asia and Eastern Europe, though he had not yet attained his 30th year. In early life, he had conceived the strongest passion to visit foreign countries, and with the avowed, but by no means the only, motive of making a pilgrimage to Mecca, quitted his house without the knowledge of his family, and proceeded by the Indus to Arabia. He had performed the Hajj, and then visited Egypt, Syria, Constantinople, Greece, and the islands of the archipelago, supporting himself during the journey by engraving the names of the faithful, which appears to be a profitable sort of occupation. With his wealth, he enjoyed the new scenes of the Levant, and united himself to other wanderers, from one of whom he had happily escaped a base attempt to poison. After an absence of 5 or 6 years, he returned to his family, who had long looked upon him as lost. His father took the earliest opportunity of settling him in life, to check his roaming propensities, so that he now lived quietly in Peshawar. He appeared quite delighted to visit us, and talk of the Nile and the pyramids, Istanbul and its Golden Horn, the accounts of which he could get few of his countrymen to believe. He looked back upon his peregrinations with great delight, and sighed that his being the father of a family prevented his joining us. This disposition to wander is a curious trait on the part of the Afghans, for they are great lovers of their country. A Mohammedan, however, is at home everywhere his creed is professed, for there is a sort of fellowship in that religion, like Freemasonry, which binds its members together. Among them there are no distinctions of grade or rank which so strongly mark the society of other sects and countries. Quail fighting. We arrived at the season of the quails, when everyone who could escape from his other vocations was engaged in hawking, netting or fighting these courageous little birds. Every Tuesday morning the chief had a meeting in his courtyard to encourage the sport. He used to send for us to witness it. It is by no means destitute of amusement whether we regard the men or the birds. For chief, servant and subject were here on an equality, the quails being the heroes, not the men. They are carried about in bags and enticed to fight with each other for grain, which is sprinkled between them. When the quail once runs, he is worthless and immediately slain, but they seldom make a precipitate retreat. Nothing can exceed the passion of the Afghans for this kind of sport. Almost every boy in the street may be seen with a quail in his hand, and crowds assemble in all parts of the city to witness their game battles. Hawking. Seeing the interest which we took in these scenes, the chief invited us to accompany him on a hawking party about 5 miles from Peshawar, but we were unsuccessful and killed nothing. We went in search of waterfowl, and a party that preceded us had disturbed the ducks. We had, however, an Afghan picnic and an insight into national manners. We sat down under a slight awning, and the servants produced 8 or 10 young lambs which had been slain on the occasion. The chief called for a knife, cut up one of them, spitted the pieces on a ramrod drawn from one of his attendants' matchlocks, and handed it to be roasted. He remarked to me that meat so dressed had a better flavour than if cooked by regular servants, and that if we were really in the field, he would hold one end of the ramrod and give the other to someone else till the meat was ready, which would make the entertainment thoroughly Dorany. I liked this unaffected simplicity. There were about 30 in the party to partake of the déjeuner, and not a morsel of it was left, so keen were our appetites, and so good our fare. But the Afghans are enormous eaters. Mullah Nujib. As the time of our departure drew near, we had nothing but a continued succession of feasting. We dined with all the chiefs and many of their sons, with priests and mirzas. Among the most pleasant of our parties was one given by Mullah Nujib, a worthy man who had made an enterprising journey into the Kaffir country at the instigation of Mr. Elphinstone, and for which he enjoys and merits a pension. He gave us good counsel and showed much interest in our behalf, but strongly dissuaded us from entertaining a holy person as our guide, on which I had resolved. The Uzbeks are described to be much under the influence of their priests and syuds, and I thought that the company of one of them might avail us on an occasion of difficulty, since Moorcroft had entirely trusted to one of them, who is now in Peshawar. Mullah Nujib assured me, on the other hand, that such a person could never extricate us from any difficulties, and would publish our approach everywhere. And he further insinuated that many of the disasters which had befallen the unfortunate Moorcroft were to be attributed to one of these worthies. Such advice from one who was a priest himself deserved notice, and I afterwards ascertained the justness of the mullah's views. It was, however, necessary to conciliate the holy man to whom I have alluded, and I visited him. His name was Fuzul Huk, and he boasts a horde of disciples towards Bokhara, nearly as numerous as the inhabitants. My introduction to him was curious, for Monsieur Court had desired his secretary to write to another holy man of Peshawar, whose name he had forgotten. In his difficulties, he applied to me, and knowing the influence of Fuzul Huk, I mentioned him at random. The letter was written, I delivered it, and the saint was gratified at its receipt from a quarter where he had no acquaintance. He received me with kindness, and tendered his services most freely, offering letters of introduction to all the influential persons in Tartary. He had heard that I was in the English employ, nor did I deem it necessary to open his eyes on the subject. I thanked him for his kindness with all the meekness and humility of a poor traveller, and he proceeded to give his advice with a considerable degree of kindness. Your safety, he said, will depend on your laying aside the name of European, at all events of Englishman. For the natives of those countries believe the English to be political intriguers and to possess boundless wealth. Common sense and reflection suggested a similar conduct, but the performance was more difficult. The saint prepared his epistles, which he sent to us. They were addressed to the king of Bokhara and the chiefs on the Oxus, 5 in number, who owned him as their spiritual guide. We were described as poor blind travellers, who were entitled to protection from all members of the faithful. They abounded in extracts from the Koran, with other moral aphorisms enlisted for the occasion on our behalf. The saint, however, made a request that we should not produce these letters unless an absolute necessity compelled us. But I looked upon them as very valuable documents. I did not quit this man's house without envying him his influence over such tribes, which he owes to his descent from a respected parent, of whom he inherited a large patrimony. I had many misgivings about him, for he is not without suspicion of having increased Moorcroft's troubles, and it is certain that the family of one of his disciples was enriched by the wealth of that ill-fated traveller. He, however, possesses documents which lead me to acquit him of everything, yet I would rather avoid than court the man, and rather please than displease him. Disadvantages of giving medicines. Among other items of advice, we were strongly recommended to desist from giving medicines to the people, for it had already rallied round the doctor some hundreds of patients, and would sound the tocsin of our approach as we advanced. I had thought that the medical character would have been our passport, and, to adventurers, I do not doubt its advantage, but our only object being to pass through in safety, it became a subject of great doubt if it should be maintained at all. Besides the continued applications of the people, which left us no time to ourselves, many surmises were made as to the riches and treasures we possessed that enabled us gratuitously to distribute medicines. It was therefore resolved to withdraw from the field by the earliest opportunity, and a plan which I had thought from the beginning as likely to aid us considerably in our enterprise was at once abandoned. The bleeding of the people would alone have furnished employment to a medical man, for the Afghans let blood annually at the vernal equinox till they reached their 40th year. The people were also labouring under a tertian fever, which increased the number of patients. The only antiquity which we discovered near Peshawar was a tope, or mound, about 5 miles distant, on the road to Kabul, and evidently of the same era as those of Manikyala and Belur. It is in a very decayed state, and the remains would not suggest any idea of the design had we not seen those in the Punjab. It was nearly 100 feet high, but the stone with which it had been faced had fallen down or been removed. We procured no coins at it, and the natives could not give any tradition farther than it was a topa. We also heard of another building similar to this in the Khyber Pass about 18 miles distant, which we could not visit from the unsettled state of the country where it is situated. It is in a perfect state of preservation, and both loftier and larger than that of Manikyala. I also heard of 8 or 10 towers of a like description towards the country of the Kafirs in Swat and Bunera. It seems very probable that these buildings are the cemeteries of kings, since they are all built with a chamber in the midst of the pile. They may, however, be Buddhist buildings. Preparations for departure. A month had now elapsed since we arrived at Peshawar, and the rapid approach of the hot weather admonished us that we need not much longer fear the snows of Kabul and Hindu Kush. The thermometer, which had stood in midday at 60 degrees on our arrival, now rose to 87 degrees. The mulberries had ripened, and the snow had entirely disappeared from the hither range. Yet the winter had been very severe, and during our stay at Peshawar, hailstones fell which were fully as large as a musket ball. All was therefore bustle for our departure, and our movements were accelerated by the arrival of a letter from Kabul, which begged us to advance without delay. Yet it was no easy matter to bring the chief to pronounce our leave, which was fixed for the 19th of April, after much procrastination. Maitre d'hotel of the chief. Among the inmates of Sultan Muhammad Khan's house, it would be unpardonable to omit the mention of his maitre d'hotel, Suta Khan, a native of Kashmir, a stout, good-humoured man who so long regaled us with his pilaus and other savoury dishes. During the whole of our stay, we were entertained by the chief, and this person, who was a merry-hearted good soul, with all the polish of his countrymen, sought to gratify us in every way. Though he did not figure in any high capacity, yet his sister was married to the chief, and his influence was considerable. He was a tall, portly man, with large black eyes, which I shall ever remember, for they followed with delight every morsel of his master's which he saw us eat. His appearance showed that he liked the good things of this life, and his disposition made him anxious to share them with others. Such was Suta Khan, the Kashmiri butler. He pressed us for some recipes to improve the gastronomic art, but we had no cook to tutor him.